and welcome to Financial Insider Weekly. I'm your host, Michael Gray, CPA. My guest today is David Kirsch, an attorney here in San Jose. David has been a tax attorney for 32 years. He worked for 4.5 years with the IRS counsel's office, litigating cases before the U.S. tax court and providing legal advice to the IRS about collection issues. Today we're going to be talking about collection issues. Anyway, he's been in private practice in San Jose since 1983. Since 1985, he's only worked on tax controversies, including collection issues, and has represented clients before the U.S. Tax Court, the U.S. District Court, Courts of Appeals, and almost made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. So David, welcome, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be here.
So today I've asked David to provide some guidance about dealing with the IRS about collection issues. In other words, I owe some back taxes, now what? So we're going to be covering highlights of a very complex subject, and so if you've got a real tangled situation, you really should get qualified tax advice about your situation. All right, David, I don't have the money to pay my taxes. Does that mean I'm a bad person?
No, Michael. People can owe taxes for a variety of reasons, including very innocent ones. Even if you file a tax return that shows you owe taxes and you don't have the money to pay it, you're not a bad person, but it is a debt that has to be resolved one way or another.
Okay.
And that's what we're here to talk about today.
That's it. Okay. All right. It's the IRS that we're dealing with. Do we deal with the same people at the IRS for collections as we do for tax audit issues?
No, there are two entirely different functions within the IRS. There is a specific and large organization for tax collection.
Yep.
Called the Collection Division, oddly enough.
Okay. And not all collection matters are audit related, of course. So.
Oh, correct.
Yeah.
They can be just that the taxpayer files a return without payment. Other than that, it usually results from some action from the IRS, whether it's an audit or a so-called trust fund recovery penalty for unpaid payroll taxes, that kind of thing.
So these are probably a lot of the ones that you see, but I mean, well, you remember years ago that there were a lot of people when we had that .com crash.
Sure.
So they owed taxes because they had exercised stock options, and then the value of their stock went into the sink, and so they suddenly didn't have the money to pay the taxes.
That's a perfect example of a taxpayer who is not a bad person.
Yeah. Okay.
But nevertheless, owed the taxes under the law.
Yeah, and anyway, well, of course, they just finally got some relief recently for the people that had the incentive stock options. Well, anyway, we'll just move on. So, how does the collection process work?
Well, first off, and most important, the IRS is different than virtually any other creditor in the land. And I say that because the IRS is the only creditor that has the legal right to what's called prejudgment attachment. They don't have to sue first and collect later. They can collect first and sue later. So you've all heard the horror stories. You know, they got my wages, they got my bank account, they got my car, they got my firstborn male child. No. But they have the power to enforce collection without having to first go to court. And that's an extremely powerful tool that they have. And it gets the attention of any taxpayer who has been ignoring them. Yes. Which brings up an important point. When you get letters from the IRS, don't throw them away. And don't leave them at the post office. Read them and communicate with the IRS. Virtually all the horror stories are people who have not communicated with the IRS.
Okay. So what's a notice of intention to levy and a right to appeal, and what's that significance for that?
In the collection process, at some point, the beginning of the collection process is the taxpayer gets a bill. You know, even if you file a return that shows you owe a balance due, and you don't send it in, the collection process doesn't begin until you get that first letter from the IRS. Dear taxpayer, you owe us $1, send it in. Mm-hmm. Respond to that letter. There are a series of 4 letters culminating in what's called a final notice of intention to levy, and it's significant for 2 very important reasons. One is that until they send that letter, and I call it the magic letter. Okay. It's a letter that's got magic words, and I'll tell you what those words are in a minute. Until they send that letter, they cannot take enforced collection, except under a very proscribed set of unusual circumstances that are way beyond the scope of today. Mm. For all intents and purposes, until they send that letter, they can't levy your wages or garnish your bank account or whatever. The other significance of that letter, and these are the magic words, is that it offers you what's called a collection due process appeal. A very important right that gives you the right to appeal, to go to an entirely different office in the IRS, the appeals office, and contest the proposed levy of your assets, including seizure of wages and bank accounts and other property. And until they send that letter, they can't take that enforcement. And if you file that appeal, they can't take that enforcement until that appeal is resolved, which could take anywhere from a few months to a couple of years, because there's a right to go to court attached to that right to appeal. And if you don't appeal, there's a 30-day hold during which you have to file that appeal. And that's a very important right. It's a one-time use it or lose it right. Even if they send you the letter 4 times, it's only the first one that gives you the right to the appeal, okay, technically. And it comes certified mail, so if you get a certified letter from the IRS, pick it up. Any letter you get from the IRS that's certified, pick it up because it's important rights attached to it. Right.
I guess there's another thing that that we talked about. Before that letter, you're probably not, you don't have an individual that's generating these collection notices. They're computer generated, isn't that right?
Usually they're computer generated at one of the IRS service centers, which is why it's important to respond to them. When you get the letter, respond with your proposal. Mm-hmm. I mean, they're going to give you 2 or 3 or maybe even 4 bites at the apple before they actually give you a live person to talk to. Mm-hmm. You have control, so send them back a letter. Dear IRS, I owe you $100,000. I can't afford to pay that right now. What I can afford is I can afford $500 a month, and here's my first payment. Mm-hmm. They'll take your money, and you're going to get a letter, even if you do that, in 99 times out of 100, or maybe it's 999 out of 1,000, you will get the next letter anyway that says, hey, we've written you before and you still haven't paid your taxes. Send your money in. Write them again. Say, dear IRS, I can't pay. I can pay $500 a month. Here's my second payment. Mm-hmm. I responded to you before, and attach a copy of the letter. And keep doing that every time they write you. A couple of things that does is, first of all, you're communicating. Second is now you have a payment track record. Mm-hmm. So it may be a little bit easier when you're actually going to deal with a living person to say, I want to pay $500 a month, and then I've already done it for 3 months. Mm-hmm. That person might just say, okay, that sounds reasonable. Okay.